So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've been alerted to just hold on for a minute. Thank you. So I can start now. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation to join our session. The title of the session is Enhancing the Food Security of Small-Scale Producers Through Climate Smart Water Management. This is in this session, we'll have some presentation on the evidences from research which has been undergoing by UMI on small-scale producers' climate resilience, followed by a panel discussion. First of all, just after the welcome, just would like to highlight why small-scale producers. When we talk about small-scale producers in the context of the research we are doing, this covers smallholder farmers, mixed crop livestock farmers, agropastoralists and pastoralists with very limited resources, whereas land and very little access to water. Most of them are actually dependent on rainfall agriculture, and they make the bulk of farmers in rural households in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa especially. So as such, most of the food is produced by them, and enhancing their food security takes us a long distance in ensuring food security of most of the countries. That's why we are focusing on small-scale agricultural producers and their climate resilience, because they are a lot vulnerable to climate change shocks. So that's why our research really focuses on ways of understanding their vulnerability, taking into account the gender dimension as well, how women, for example, and other marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by climate change, and then what kind of recommendation solutions can we propose which will enhance their climate resilience. So this is a project which is funded through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It has been going on since late 2021, effectively from 2022. At the beginning, we'll run a short video, about 5 minutes, which has been shot in the field in what we call learning watersheds, which is part of the Awash River Basin in Ethiopia. After the video, we'll have a couple of presentations which will give you some data information from the ground, what you call evidences, and then with some recommendations, which will lead us to the panel discussion. In the panel discussion, we'll explore actually some of the ideas, how, what is the best way of ensuring the resilience of small-scale producers. Without further ado, first, I would like to the support guys, the technical support, to run the video now. Thank you very much.
collaborative efforts. Despite these challenges, there are local initiatives that serve as good practices in water management and can be supported and replicated in other catchment areas. These initiatives include the restoration of degraded lands, water storage techniques, and climate-smart farming practices like intercropping.
በምንድነው ይሄ መሬት ሊያገግም የቻለው? ውሃን በማገር ነው፣ አፈሩን በማገር ነው። አለዛ መሬቱ ዘቅዛቃ ነው። ራሱ በፀሐይ ጊዜ ራሱ ውሃ ስናጠጣ ተጠንቅቀን ነው። ለምን የዚህ የቲቦ ውሃ ራሱ ይዞት እንዳይሄድ ማለት ነው። ለምንድን ነው ያን ሁሉ ስናረግ አፈሯን ተጠንቅቀን ነው፣ ሸርሽሮ ይዞት እንዳይሄድ ማለት ነው። እንደ ክብ አድርገን እንትን እንላለን የስሩን እንደገና ተላይ ደግሞ ገበድ አድርገን ላይ ውሃው እንዲቆም እናረጋለን። ያው እርፈት የለም፣ ውስጥ ለውስጥ ነው የምንለው ማለት ነው።
One of the key components of the project is to address the gender dimension to ensure inclusive solutions. To address this issue, UMI has a dedicated gender team working closely with local communities to comprehend the specific impacts faced by women and identify effective solutions that have worked in the past. In doing so, UMI aims to ensure that no one is left behind and that the solutions implemented are inclusive. The ongoing first phase of the project is primarily dedicated to collecting the existing evidence base, with a specific focus on assessing the impact of climate extremes on small-scale producers. This evidence base is being gathered to develop a comprehensive understanding of the actual effects experienced by different community groups.
We are currently working on the concept for the next phase. My hope and my target really is making a visible change to the livelihoods of small-scale producers. Quite a number of things have been done in the past, but still the problem continues. So we really have to make it work. We really have to make change the lives of those people who are most of the population in the rural Europe. Thank you, the IT team. Hope you enjoyed the video. Now, without wasting time, I will invite, now we have series of presentations which will present to you some of the evidences from the ground. So I will not really interfere. First, Meron will be presenting on the vulnerability based on the analysis she has conducted, and then followed, we have a couple of other presentations. Meron, you have the floor.
All right, good morning, everyone. Okay, great. So the title of my presentation is on climate change vulnerability of the small-scale producers in the Awash Basin, trying to understand the key causes. To give you the context of what Awash Basin is, it's one of the important river basins in Ethiopia because of its socio-economical importance. More than 65% of the industries exist in Awash Basin. There are large irrigation facilities there. And also most of the rural population are small-scale producers. So the sedentary farmers, agro-pastoralists and pastoralists. And I usually say Awash Basin is a basin of extremes. That's because we experience both kinds of climate extremes, droughts and floods. Especially the main rainy season, when it's drought or when it's floods, it depends on the year and the kind of large-scale drivers that affects it. So from the figures that you can see, there are both kinds of spatial variability and also the temporal variability. The spatial variability you can see in the highlands of the basin, it gets a lot of rainfall. And when you get to the lowlands, it barely gets about 200 millimeters or 100 millimeters of rainfall per year. And from the temporal variation aspect, rainfall comes only in three months, the summer season, most of the 80% of it. And that's the period where we experience devastating floods. In the dry season, it's usually water scarcity. And in the main season, if rainfall fails, then it's a very devastating drought for the area. So as I said, this both extremes exist in the Awash Basin. And just to give you an example, in the summer of 2020, it was a very heavy rainfall period, and a lot of flooding happened at that year, with thousands displaced, as you can see in that figure. On the other hand, drought is more persistent in the area. So the most recent example will be the summer of 2015. That was the worst drought in 5 decades. And we can compare the 1894-84 and the 2015 drought at that period, and millions of people were affected in the 2015 period. And a lot of humanitarian needs were needed. So in this figure, you can see that the dry spells were much more in the 2015 than in 1984. So these extremes have both impacts people, agriculture, livestock, and the economy in general. So when you look at this climate exposure, we try to look at changes in precipitation and temperature, in a particular focus on droughts for this project. So at basin scale, when we look at temperature changes for the past 40 years or more, especially the maximum temperature has been consistently increasing with statistically significant increase. As you can see in the left corner figure. And the other problem is this rainfall variability. So in this figure, what you are seeing is the bulk season that's from March to May. It shows high variability. The start of the onset and the cessation is very different from year to year. So this is affecting any kind of agricultural activity that happens in the bulk season. So when you look at the general basin, there's a large part of the basin is impacted by climate change, and especially related to droughts with precipitation deficits and temperature changes. And this is the past historical data. When you look at the future projections, the situation is more or less similar. Based on this ensemble mean calculation from 7 climate models, we try to project for the 2050s. And again, the maximum temperature keeps on increasing for this basin from a range of 0.5 up to 2.5 degrees centigrade increases projected by 2050s. In terms of rainfall, it remains uncertain, but the spatial variability and the year-to-year variability will also increase. So this temperature increase will eventually bring more extreme cases for this basin. And the water management challenges that we are trying to look at from climate perspective in this basin are the 3 of them. One is this climate extremes that is, as I said, floods and droughts. The other is the rainfall variability. And the third is this increasing water scarcity. So that's both green and blue. So this climate change will make all of these challenges even worse. When we say this SSPs vulnerability, I've tried to divide the challenges into 2. One is climate related, the other is the non-climate related aspects. So here we've done an analysis of the past 40 years of data and how they relate with drought. And rainfall fairer in July, specifically, and in Ethiopian calendar, we have Hamle. It's more or less the 2nd July up to the first week of August. If rainfall fails at that period, it's usually an indication of high drought in the area. And trying to make water available for that period will have a lot of good results. So this result is the same for the whole basin, or when we look at the smaller sub-basins or the learning watersheds that we have looked at. And this historical drought years usually coincide with El Niño years. For instance, if I tell you this year, in May and June, we had a lot of rainfall, but in August and July, we don't have a rainfall at the moment. And some of the farmers where we work on are telling us it's going to be a bit concerning for this year. So because of the El Niño that's projected this year. So this is one of the climate related challenges, the large scale drivers because of the El Niño event. The other would be the non-climate drivers, which my colleagues will also talk about. Like the river bank erosion, which has been happening for so many years, and that's affecting the farmers and the small scale producers. Also sediment accumulation in river beds. There's also uncontrolled surface irrigation withdrawal from the river, so using pumps, and agricultural encroachment in water bodies, and also eutrophication, for example, as you can see in the top figure. So with all these problems, these small-scale producers have their adaptive capacity is low. And part of it is because they have low crop pasture or pasture land per capita, the amount of land they have. And also in terms of infrastructure, most of them have low access to irrigation infrastructure, a lot of inefficient use of water and so on. And this degraded land and other socioeconomic problems just because they are small scale producers, that also contributes to their low adaptive capacity. So this makes small scale producers vulnerable for both for the climate change impacts. And some of the solutions that my colleagues will talk about later will include improving data and information availability at different scales, and also from using water efficiently, having integrated water storage options, and also using more efficient systems for irrigation will help the small-scale producers to better adapt to the change in climate that's happening in the basin at the moment and also in the future. Thank you. And the next will be Liki. She will talk about the gender aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Meron, and good morning, everyone. I'll be talking about gender and social inclusion study we did under this project. To start with, water, it's critical to enable small-scale producers to adapt to climate change, but it all depends on how small-scale producers access and use water, because it all depends on their social identity. And most studies in Africa show that women are most impacted by climate change than other social groups. So under this study, what we did was we explored the key barriers that impact the design and implementations of gender responsive, climate smart ag water technologies and practices. And in our case, climate smart water technologies and practices include conservation agriculture and small scale irrigation. And the research question we aim to answer were, first, we assessed what the water access, need, and use of women and other marginalized SSPs was impacted by climate change. And following that, we assessed the impact of existing ag water technologies and practices on these social groups. And thirdly, we looked at the key elements for a gender responsive design and implementations of water interventions for climate impacts. The method we deployed was this. It is a qualitative study which was carried out in 4 districts, 2 districts in Afar region and 2 districts in Amhara region. And we collected data using FGDs, in-depth household interviews, and key informant interviews. And the data analysis was a content analysis using the gender empowerment framework. To give you a context of the study sites, regarding livelihoods, in 2 of the districts, the dominant livelihood activity was crop livestock integrated farming. And in the other 2 sites, there were agro-pastoralists with few practicing pure pastoralism. And across the study sites, communities were challenged with too much of rain and drought, which have gendered impacts on workloads and livelihood loss. And in response to the climate impacts, communities were practicing conservation agriculture in communal areas and private plots, depending on the context. And these initiatives were also supported by the local government and NGOs, which target different social groups and with different objectives. Looking at the results, women and most marginalized small-scale producers were most impacted by climate change due to issues related to resources, their agency, and also institutional structures. Looking at the results on the resources, there are policies in place that grant equal property and property rights, including land, and women and small-scale producers are aware of these rights. However, because of the different interventions by schools, media, the local government, they are aware of their rights, but results show that there are gender differences in terms of accessing resources and resource ownership. And this is driven by a number of interactive factors. For example, the social cultural norm is one of the reasons why women and small-scale marginalized groups have limited access to resources and limited resource ownership. In addition to that, absence of gender-responsive approach by the different formal and informal institutions is also the other reason why women have limited access to and ownership to resources. And this is exacerbated by poverty and climate change. Looking at how agency affects the design and implementations of gender-responsive climate-smart agriculture technologies and practices is across the study sites, men and women participate in different initiatives that are related to conservation agriculture and small-scale irrigation. However, looking at their participation in decision-making processes at household and communal level, at the household level, there is a growing culture where spouses consult each other before making any decision. But at communal level, the willingness and ability of women to participate in decision-making processes is low compared to other social groups. And a number of factors contribute for this. It's not only one reason that contribute for this, but a number of interacting reasons. And these include their workload, the restricted mobility, the low value given to their voices, and their lack of confidence and experience. And the last component that we looked at was how institutional structures affect the design and implementations of agriculture technologies and practices. And accordingly, what we learned is that there are laws, policies, institutional structures, and interventions that aim to ensure gender equality and women empowerment in conservation agriculture and small-scale irrigation initiatives. And also government supports this in different ways. But looking at the equity and inclusiveness of these interventions, there are challenges. And the challenge is mainly driven by absence of transformative gender mainstreaming approach. And this is happening because of limited institutional capacities, which are related to finance, human and technical capacities, as well as structural gender barriers, which are related to workload, restricted mobility, limited access to resources, and criteria for membership. So in general, what we can say is that impact of climate change on women from diverse social groups and marginalized groups is highly contextual. It's not the same for everyone. And gender and intersectional categories, they influence their access to resources and services, as well as their participation in decision-making processes. And thirdly, the design and implementations of transformative gender mainstreaming in conservation agriculture and small-scale irrigation initiatives is challenged by limited institutional capacities and gender structural barriers. Thank you for your attention. And next is Wendy.
Morning. You have seen now, you have here and seen a lot of challenge and also a lot of problems with that occurring in the basin. And I will try to just present how the local communities really perceive the role of land and water management practices to address natural resource degradation and contribute to reducing the vulnerability of the communities or the local communities. So just in the context, I will not spend too much time because we have already heard a lot of challenge and the context, but to put all the discussion into context, just borrowing the natural resource degradation and vulnerability nexus framework, which is developed by the World Bank independent groups. In the left side, you have the natural resources, and the right side, you have the resource-dependent people, the farmers, the small-scale producers, investors, and the resources are under heavy pressure or severe land degradations, which manifests itself through loss of soil fertility, loss of forest cover, loss of biodiversity and reductions in productivity, all these things, and they are vulnerable. This will lead to the communities to more vulnerable in terms of they are not able to really adapt to the weather extremes, drought and floods, and also the communities will be poverty stricken, food insecure, conflict resource use. All these things make again the communities vulnerable. And when the communities become more vulnerable, they more depend on natural resources, which again aggravate land degradation or natural degradation. Then the nexus you'll see at the center. So the nexus always continues. There is a resource dependent people, the resources are degrading, the local communities become more vulnerable and again depend more on the resource. So this will continue. So, but recognizing this, there are a lot of efforts going in the basin and throughout the country. Multiple physical and biological land and water management practices are going on. This will include, for example, rainwater harvesting using farm pond. This kind of activities really help us farmers to diversify their crops, which means they help us to build their assets. It helps us build food and nutrition security so that the communities become more resilient and also the environment as well becomes more resilient. There is intercropping practice in irrigated field. You can see in the right bottom picture, there is annual crops, there is high value crops such as fruits growing in the same field in the irrigated areas, which makes them more diverse, build assets, increase income, so that the communities and the environment will be more, relatively more resilient. And in the left side, you have some terraces. One of this kind of, the limitation of this kind of conservation measure is they lack a short-term economic benefit. All this long-term conservation approach, they lack short-term economic benefit, but the farmers, our farmers are more interested in short-term economic benefit because they are poor, they want to live today, so they have to get something today. So to address this kind of problems of long-term conservation measures, terraces are integrated with high-value crops such as papaya trees and fruit trees, so that the community gets benefits today, at the same time, working to achieve the long-term conservation goal. These kind of things are going on. But still, there are issues remaining. One of the issues is how this land and water management practice become sustainable and the benefits really long-lasting. So this really requires better planning, design, and implementation of land and water management practices. And among different things, one of the things we need is we need to understand the local community perspectives on the benefits and costs of this land and water management practice. So this component of the work is designed to understand the local community perspectives on the benefits and costs of land and water management practices. When you look at the benefits, the communities listed a number of benefit factors and cost factors. For example, the communities listed like 62 benefit factors of 9 assessed land and water management practices. They also listed like 38 cost factors of these 9 land and water management practices. But for all land and water management practices, the benefit factors, the number of benefit factors are larger than the cost factors. At the same time, the rating of the importance of the benefits and the cost, the mean rating of the benefits and the cost also larger for all these land and water management practices. But still, this simply tells us that the local communities are positive, and also the land and water management practices are contribution to reduce natural resource degradation, at the same time to reduce vulnerability. But there are something we need to improve, because there are also 38 cost factors listed by the local communities. We need to address or reduce these cost factors to make them so sustainable, and also the benefits will be long-lasting. And we also closely looked at the food security contribution of land and water management practices of 3 land and water management practices like stone bund, soil bund, and small-scale irrigation. Adopters of stone bund and soil bund are not food secure compared to non-adopters. But adopters of small-scale irrigations are food secured compared to non-adopters. This simply tells us that our selection of technologies should be context-specific, should be goal-oriented. If we need to increase food security within a short period of time, we may need to focus on small-scale irrigation. But our goal is to increase, to reduce runoff, to reduce erosion, and to protect downstream infrastructures, water infrastructures from sedimentation. We may focus on soil bund, stone bund, and other terraces. So the selection of technology should be context-specific and goal-oriented. This is just one of the land use land cover analysis, which simply complements how local communities perceive about land water management practices. The land use land cover analysis also tells us in those learning watershed, the forest cover and shrubs are increasing with time, while the croplands and grazing lands are decreasing, which means, again, one of the benefits which mentioned by the local communities are these technologies are restoring the landscape, reducing soil erosion, reducing runoff, and increasing agricultural production, which is also confirmed by the land use land cover analysis. Just to summarize things, if you properly implement, design, and monitor and practice all these land and water management practices, they have a good contribution to reduce natural resource degradation. And through this, they have also a contribution to reduce or address the vulnerability of local communities through increasing resource availability, building assets, just adapting to weather extremes through drought and flood, so that they can help also to build a resilient community and a resilient environment. But as I said, the selection and implementation of land water management practices should be context specific and at the same time should be goal oriented. But we need to have some to change, to improve some of the things. Land and water management practice within a landscape should be diverse and include different practices at the same time. And the planning and implementation of land and water management practice should consider balancing the short-term economic loss with the long-term conservation environmental benefits, and capacitating local practitioners such as these irrigation water users should be needed, because we need a local capacity to manage our scarce resources. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, colleagues, for the presentation. So we have heard about the challenges and the gender dimension as well, and especially land cover change and the flood and the drought in the same place. One year you have floods, and then the next year you have droughts. And also the little resource endowment by small-scale producers. This has evidence from the ground. And then what the small-scale producers really value as something what can address their problems and so on. Now the question is now going forward, and what kind of solutions, what kind of innovations or interventions do we recommend to enhance the climate resilience of small-scale producers, which actually live in very diverse agroecological zones and in different socioeconomic settings and cultural settings as well, because the Awash Basin, you can divide into three main areas, like the highlands, where most of predominantly the farmers, they are mixed crop livestock farmers. And then you have the low-lying areas, which are predominantly pastoralists, or mainly pastoralists, very little agro-pastoralists, and entirely different setting. So here, what I'm going to present really is some of like an evolving thought, how we can really address the climate resilience, vulnerability of small-scale producers. So just like a thought, which still we are discussing internally. So, so when you talk about, we know a lot about climate smart agriculture. A lot have been written about it. What about climate smart water management? Or sometimes I use the term climate resilient water management. So what are we, aiming at? For example, I think of like reorienting existing water resource management practices to minimize the negative socioeconomic and environmental consequences of changes to water resources systems due to climate change. So when you say changes, we'll see later, mainly Meron has also flagged that when we are talking about scarcity of water, increasing or like a variable, highly variable availability of water, let me say. And we are talking about, in the context of especially sedentary farmers, variability in rainfall. When you talk about variability in rainfall, we are talking about variability in quantity, volume of rainfall, but also in timing of rainfall, which is also very important. The vast majority of small-scale producers are not irrigators. That just depend on rainfall, which means if the rainfall doesn't come on time, then there is a serious consequence, like, for example, what's happening this year in most of, I think, Ethiopia, because it's an El Nino year, a lot of rainfall in the short rain season, which you call the bulk season in Ethiopia. A lot of places, they grow during the bulk or the short rainy season, and also the main rainy season, which goes from approximately June, July up to September. So this year what happened was because of El Nino. There was a lot of rainfall during the bulk rainy season, which is a short rainy season. And then during now the main rain season right now, there's a shortage of rainfall. So that means we are talking about variability. Rainfall means variability in timing, onset and cessation, but variability in quantity, in volume of rainfall as well. And the other category of climate change impact on water is flood and drought. These are extremes, all right? Even if the rainfall comes on time, there's very little rainfall, or there's a lot of rainfall coming, in the usual time, but a lot of rainfall causing a lot of flooding. So we have to deal with all this. So when we discuss internally about in this project, so what we are talking about really is about balancing supply and demand for water resources on multiple spatial scales and different contexts in different agroecological zones in the context of climate change, minimizing negative consequences of extremes, and then enhancing water resource planning and management in light of increasing climate variability and change, because everything is changing. The time is changing, the volume is changing, year-to-year variability itself is changing, because then the solutions we are recommending should also take into account all this. Now, so we categorize it into three. So we're saying managing water scarcity, blue and green water, and then improving management of variability of rainfall, and also like improving the management of extremes. So the kind of solutions we are recommending fall under three categories, what you call, I'm not sure if you can see what is there. It should be about infrastructure. Infrastructure is very important because we have seen the result when Dr. Welde presented, those small scale irrigators, they are better off compared to others who would not irrigate. So small scale infrastructure is important. We have seen it on the ground. Those who are, for example, have cascade of water ponds and which they use to grow fruit trees, for example, that's much better off than others. So for this reason, small scale infrastructure is absolutely important. Water storage, irrigation, etc. The other is information. Rainfall may not come on time. So the farmers, they don't have the information. There are some efforts already to provide information about the timing of rainfall. Then that has to be coupled with, for example, some other solutions. What will happen if the rainfall is not coming on time? What will happen if the rainfall is not going to be adequate, for example? So information becomes very important, and the tools associated with that information is very important. The other is institutions. When we talk about institutions, we are not talking about the national level only. We are talking about community-based organizations as well. So these are, the three kinds of solutions, categories of solutions we are putting together to address the vulnerability of small-scale producers. So I'll just go quickly because this is also introduction to the panel discussion, which will start shortly. So first is climate resilience of infrastructure, which is absolutely important. So it's not only that we have irrigation system or a small-scale irrigation, they have to be efficient. They have to be equipped with, for example, better water management technologies as well. So irrigation, the fact that we have irrigation is not sufficient, really. So we need to have climate resilient irrigation. We need to invest in water storage. We're talking again, starting from water harvesting. Of course, different size of dams and groundwater reserves emitted, for example, like solar suitability of, soil suitability map for Ethiopia, where solar irrigation pumps are being increasingly used, for example, tapping groundwater, for example, which really helps small scale producers with some kind of business model for financing those solar pumps. Then new design standards, because small scale infrastructure, they're also vulnerable to climate extremes as well. Meaning, for example, the flood, for example. A lot of water coming, a lot of sediment coming, just washes away the infrastructure. For this reason, we need to have new design standards for small scale infrastructure, which is very important. Again, investing in more efficient irrigation technology. So as I've said earlier, the fact that we have irrigation canals and the headworks, etc., does not really solve the problem. We need to have water efficient irrigation system because we are talking about scarcity of water as well. Then we need to have also all these nature-based solutions, catchment management, because really, especially in the context of small-scale producers, the dry weather flow is very important, because if you are talking about small-scale irrigation, you don't have big storage. Because you don't have big storage, it means then you rely on the minimum flow in the stream. And that can be enhanced through what we call the nature-based solutions in the catchments, which are feeding that stream. This is absolutely important. And we have seen it also on the evidence, and also the small-scale producers, they value that as well. So when we talk about infrastructure, we're not talking about only gray infrastructure, we are talking about also green infrastructure. So what we call nature-based solutions. So we need to have an integrated storage solution. Then we have the information bit, which is very important. Usually what happens is we have early warning systems. Almost all countries, we have weather forecasts, etc. But usually they are supply driven, which means then the small scale producers, they have really little access because of several factors. For this reason, we need really rethink about the early warning system so that, the small scale producers really access, they get the information in the manner they can use it. But not only that, that information has to be coupled with solutions, bundles of solutions. What will happen? For example, they get the information, rainfall the coming year is going to be relatively lower than what it used to be, for example, and there need to be some actions they can do, they can access, they need to be supporting that. So early warning systems is one example. And increasingly, look, in most of African countries, the ground-based monitoring system, hydrometeorological monitoring system really is falling because, it has declined over the years. So there's a report by the WMO also earlier, when I was working for the Nile Basin Initiative, I've also seen it in the Nile Basin countries. So, but increasingly at the same time, Earth observation has become more and more accessible. Satellite remote sensing is providing a lot of information at affordable cost and, across the globe, across the continent. For this reason, I really advocate increasing use of Earth observation. You may have a dedicated research on that, and so that, we can also address the information gap. Then the river basin, the modeling system to help in catchment planning, water allocation system. What we have also observed in the catchments where we have worked is small scale irrigation are driven pretty much by farmers, by themselves, which means there's no catchment outlook. Nobody really knows how much water is being used by the irrigators. But this potentially, if it increases, could lead to conflict because the water may not be sufficient. For this reason, really, a catchment level water allocation, planning is absolutely important. But there are the institutional infrastructure in place. In Ethiopia, for example, we have the Warada level. They call it Warada, more district level, water bureaus, agriculture bureaus, and irrigation bureaus as well. But they are really very little equipped with the tools to have a catchment level water allocation, which is absolutely important because the real focus really is small scale producers. So resilient institutions, why we call them resilient, because there is a lot of institutional flux. I know about Ethiopia, for example, there's a lot of change in the institutions. The structures are changing from time to time. And that really, you lose the institutional memory and capacity as well. You always start from pretty much scratch. For this reason, we need to have really stable, at the same time, agile institutions to respond to rapidly evolving disasters, whether they are droughts or floods, and especially focusing on small scale producers. And usually the institutional capacity is low at the moment you go to the lower level. At a national level, probably have capacity, but at the lower level, which is very important for small scale producers, the capacity is not there, or very little capacity is there. Okay, this is pretty much what I wanted to say as the introduction to the panel. But before we call on the panel to come to the stage, as per the program, I would like to give the floor for, let's say, 2 or maximum 3 burning questions, and then we go into the panel. And then after the panel, depending upon the time, we'll have more time for questions. Now, thank you for your attention. Probably if there are some 2, 3 burning questions also from online participants or from people who are here, you're most welcome. There must be someone who is following the chat box, maybe, if you have questions. Okay. Good. Those who are in the room, maybe you can raise your hand and then you can put your question. Those who are participating online, maybe somebody has to check the chat box. You help? Okay, thank you. Yes. So when you ask your question, please tell us your name and where you're from.
David Agngome from TU Delft. I'm a junior reporter as well here. So my question is, how well these outcomes being implemented in the society or in your country in general? Is it just research, or you are also trying really to share the knowledge and make it available to everyone?
Should we collect the three questions and then respond? At the time. Okay. So thank you. This is the first phase of project, which is focusing on research and to come up with the recommendations. But at the same time, we are also sharing the evidences we have with the local communities as well. We had a workshop around mid of June, where we brought people from the district level as well, and then trying to kind of co-validate the finding and then develop the solutions together. That is the level it is now. But hopefully our plan is there will be a subsequent phase where we'll be piloting the recommendations we are putting together here.
Thank you. My name is Saad Ali. I'm from Palestine. My question specifically from institutional point of view, can you please just elaborate what are the measures taken in the basin level, among the farmers in order to meet the allocated water?
Can you repeat the question again?
From an institutional point of view, what are the measures taken in order to ensure that the allocated water in the basin level among the farmers will be respected?
Colleagues, would you like to reply, or you want to give every question to me? Wale or Meron? Okay, I'll try. Please. Okay.
At the moment, water allocation is not done throughout the basin. It's only somewhere in upstream, and it's mostly for the large-scale farmers. So there's no water allocation process in the basin. It's just done randomly.
Okay, just to give you a bit of context, in the river basin, in this river basin we are studying, there are major dams, right? And then there are commercial irrigation schemes, which really grow sugarcane, for example, right? So the allocation the government ministry does is regarding the amount of water collected or stored in the dam, they allocate it for this major big irrigation schemes. But the small scale producers we are talking about, there are of three categories, as I've said earlier. The sedentary farmers more are on the highlands, all right? So they are not really benefiting out of that allocation because it's on the main river. So a small scale, at small catchment level, there's no really a such water allocation scheme. That's where the challenge is. But on the lower and the main stem of the river, there are also small scale producers which are largely pastoralists lying in the lower side of the river. They get benefits sometimes from the allocation of water, but usually it is driven by either hydropower or large scale irrigation. So we're trying to find out like what is the multi-scale level, the multi-scale water allocation scheme that can work for all. Good question. Sorry, Wale. You need to have no.
If I understood correctly, or do you want more from the room?
Either be here.
Thanks for the question. Maybe your question just focusing on the farmers. I think we need to highlight the importance or the activities of water user association. At farmers level, there are water user associations selected by the communities, and they allocate, not in scientific way, they allocate water for each beneficiaries to the farmers in their own way, in the traditional way. So I think we need to appreciate the role of water user associations working at grassroots level, distributing water to each and every farmers and running the small scale irrigation practices. Just to add this one.
So one last question that I promised to three. Yes. Can you have the mic? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm from China Water Risk from Hong Kong. I'm also a junior rapporteur. just a quick question. I think, you said early warning systems are very important for these small scale farmers, and it's really difficult with the lack of knowledge and technology over there. But how much time is sufficient for these small scale farmers to prepare? Is it months? Is it days? How much time do they need to prepare?
Very good question. The lead time, right? How much lead time?
Yeah.
Well,
time,
that's very, very interesting question. It's going to design early warning system. The lead time is important. So, especially if you are talking about sedentary farmers, usually there are seasonal forecasts which are made in terms of time that is quite sufficient. But usually the problem is that information does not reach. It's not sufficiently localized, especially. For example, if you say in this region this is going to happen, but it doesn't really is contextualized to the specific location. Those seasonal forecasts are good enough in terms of lead time because it's about like the planting date, for example. It's about the planting date. But also the other decision is if the rainfall amount is less than the average, there it might also help them in crop selection as well. So the seasonal forecasts are good enough. The question is now about making it more local, making it available. So we now thank you very much for the questions. And there is a question from Zoom. Yes. Okay. Yeah, please, Meron.
Okay, Robert says, I'm concerned about the impact of climate change in women. What's the mitigation factors as women are same in the world and have role to bring up families? He says, I'm Robert from Kenya.
It's automatic. It's going to be Likay to answer this question.
Yeah. He says, I'm concerned about the impact of climate change in women. What is the mitigation factors as women are the same in the world and have role to bring up families? The mitigation factor for climate change.
Be done, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it is context specific. We can't say like, this is what should be done, but depending on the context, by understanding what the structural gender barriers are on the ground, then we can say this can be done. For example, if because of the social cultural norms, if there are imbalances in labor and power at the household level, then transformative approaches need to be implemented. So it all depends on the context. Thank you.
So thank you very much. In the Zoom, there are two more questions, but in the interest of time, we are moving to the panel discussion. May I call upon our panelists kindly come to the podium. Dr. Mikhail Kiza from the NVI Initiative Secretariat. Kiza is my former colleague, and now he's the Deputy Executive Director of the NVI Secretariat. Then we have Anton Earl from CIWI, and we have Dr. Giriraj from IMI. We have also another panelist. This is Deepa Joshi, the IMI Gender and Social Inclusion expert, but she's joining online. Is there a way to show the Zoom here? Oh, okay, it's already. Hi, Deepa, thank you very much for joining. Can you hear me, Deepa?
Yeah, I can hear you. Am I audible?
Wait. Wait a minute, for a minute. Go ahead. Okay, talking about climate water management, we talked about resilient infrastructure, both green and gray. We talked about early warning system, decision support tools, stable, incredible, and agile institutions as well. Now we have, we'll get some reflection from our panelists coming from really diverse backgrounds, then also working in different institutional settings as well. And I really thank very much for the panel. So my first question is to Giriraj, and Given what we have heard so far, the evidence from the ground, and what do you think, how can early warning system benefit small scale producers better to adapt to climate change impacts? Can you share some lessons from Africa and Asia from your experience? And where we have also a question of the lead time, which was asked earlier. So I will give you the mic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Abdul Karim, and thank you for inviting to this panel discussion. I think it was a very excellent presentation in terms of how the basin can improve in terms of the institution, in terms of the understanding on the variability, and last but not least on the gender and the institutional aspect. What our previous participant have asked about the importance of early warning and the climate services is very critical. And given we are in a stage where the farmers can, while they are able to use the traditional knowledge, they no longer only depend on the traditional knowledge in terms of keeping their seeds and management practices. They need to adapt to the climate variability, and in terms of the aspects related to the climate change, variability, and the short-term forecast variability that the Met department is advocating. So it is imperative that without any early warning and climate services, farmers can no longer manage their production risk, right? So I have a couple of points to highlight that. And we also have seen recently there was a assessment done by World Meteorological Organization that points out that having the reliable and accurate early warning and climate services can benefit roughly about $30 billion in terms of de-risking the production, and over $2 billion in terms of the aspects in terms of reducing the asset losses, right? So this is the findings from the WMO in terms of the aspects of climate services. Now, when we look at the kind of information that the farmers need, not just about farmers, but also the meteorological department, agriculture extension, private sector, agricultural bank, they all need a different set of information in a different context. It may be not just a so-and-so temperature with so-and-so rainfall. For example, if we talk about a farmer, it's all about next 5 days, how much you need to schedule a water, or whether you need to provide supplementary fertilizers, or in terms of whether you should do an early harvest or not. And then you look at the climate variability, because climate variability is very important in terms of when the rainy season is going to end or it's going to start. This is very crucial in terms of knowing pre-harvesting or a post-production losses. That information is very critical. And last but not least, on the climate change, the maps that were presented by my colleagues that clearly highlights how you need to also look at the agroecological zonation and the process. So my summary to these elements are sevenfold in terms of the experiences IMI has brought in different part of the region in Africa and Asia. One is on the timely information. We have shown a farmer in Sri Lanka delaying a forecast of 3 to 4 days from the precipitation. He was able to delay the harvesting of the groundnut farmers, right? So there are countries have shown the net benefit of climate services, specifically the short-term forecast. And adaptive planning is very critical, because why I say adaptive planning is critical, because with the kind of climate information in place, the farmers can really look at, limiting their resources more effectively, and importantly, looking at when to invest in irrigation, energy cost, and scheduling the seed inputs in terms of drought resistant seeds. But equally, government has a big role to play in terms of making sure these resistant varieties are made available with the seasonal forecast that the agencies can provide to the Ministry of Agriculture going forward. There are two critical input from the early warning is the access to finance. Knowing that if the season is quite good or above normal rainfall, the agriculture banks can timely prepare. This is the kind of productions are going to come. Let us lend more loans to those farmers, whether it's a rain-fed or irrigated farmers. And also the other private sector is also the insurance company can use this data to de-risk their production by timely insuring those farm fields as well. By default, whoever farmers takes a loan, if insurance are provided in an add-on model, it really helps the farmers to provide scaling these financial solution. In summary, I would say that there is a critical role of not just a single agency or a community, the role of government, NGOs, the private sector equally have to play a role on the valuation of these climate services and the early warning. This will really help small scale farmers productions to improve, as well as reducing their asset losses and the yield losses as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Giriraj. Maybe I will, given time, I'll come back to you about the insurance issue later on, the role of private sector and government. But now let me move to Anton. Anton, now my question really to you is, how do we scale watershed management practices to help small scale producers? And can you share serious experiences? Because we have examples in isolated areas. And now the question is now, because we have the vast majority of rural households in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, especially are small-scale producers. So scaling is a big issue. We have examples of innovations that have worked on a small scale. Then what are the experiences you can share with us about scaling of this kind of interventions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdul Karim. That's a crucial question, that how do we get these issues to scale? I would like to start with an apology, and apologize also on behalf of my fellow panelists for this being a male-only panel. And I'm sure when it comes to this crucial issue around smallholder agriculture, we recognize that having the woman present and speaking is actually vital. It's interesting for me, when we speak to local farming communities, smallholder farmers in Southern Africa, where we are doing much of our work, myself and my team, that when we speak to farmers, and we ask them technical details about how are they trying to prepare for climate change and responding to becoming more resilient to a changed climate. It's the women that know the details on what's going on. So you see the farming setup, but it's a case of the farmer and her husband rather than the other way around, which is great. And you actually see that on the ground. So I think we often a little bit step behind. But you ask about scale. The issue is over here that the farmer is actually fulfilling a landscape management function. If you think about the video we just watched over here from IMI, there's a beautiful line over there about one of the families that you're working with, that you interviewed, where they were saying, well, we are working in the catchment and we are trying to reduce erosion, trying to reduce runoff of water, trying to improve the infiltration of rainwater into the ground. And we do this work all day, every day. And that's really powerful if you think about it. I mean, that's a lot of hard work. And that's the reality across most of Africa for smallholder agriculture. So this landscape management function actually makes the farmer the frontline water manager in Africa. But it's a job they don't get paid for. They don't get very much support for at all. But I think that when we recognize that by improving small-scale agriculture at large scale, at catchment scale, you're generating these water management benefits through catchment conservation, through improved management of the soil resources, that you're actually protecting investments that you might make later on downstream in dams and in river management, because there's less sediment flowing into those dams. When you recognize that link, it also opens up the possibility of attracting finance to supporting those farmers, because now they're not just farming for subsistence, they're also doing water management. And as all of us are involved in water management, we get paid a salary. So farmers won't necessarily get paid a salary for their work, but they should be getting support. And when we speak of subsistence farming, I mean, that's a term that is also problematic. We'll never talk about a subsistence entrepreneur. We call them small and medium enterprises. And yet with farmers, we somehow view them as being caught in the cycle of subsistence. And water is certainly a necessary condition for them to break out of that cycle, but not a sufficient condition. Because farmers also, especially in the face of a changed climate, they also need to invest in better agricultural inputs. So have access to better soil nutrients, access to better seed varieties that are more drought tolerant. Now, all of that comes with an opportunity cost, sometimes direct financial cost, other times, of course, just their own labor. And where do they place that? And a farmer is not going to make use of that opportunity cost of investing in those other areas like better seeds and better fertilizers if they are worried that there's not enough moisture at root zone when it comes to plant growth time. So by now working with these kind of approaches that we've been hearing about, where you can actually improve access to water for the plants, whether it's through improved rain-fed agriculture, supplementary irrigation, doesn't matter which approach you take. But when you can do that and allow farmers to do that at scale, you start building up into these sort of positive cycles where they can then say, okay, now I'm going to make those other kind of investments. And that's really what CIWI is doing, trying to scale up the good work that's being done by organizations like IMI and your local partners that you're working with on the ground. We are collaborating with the Zambezi Watercourse Commission in Southern Africa, where you have 8 countries that have come together, and it's an intergovernmental commission that's recognized the role of smallholder farmers, which is really innovative. And they are saying we need to find ways to invest in them and see them, these smallholder farmers, as being part of our water management solution for this catchment. So by doing that, they're actually taking that first step. So I think it's important when we're looking at scale to say, but us as the policy and research world out there, which partners can we work with that can upscale this? And of course, we need to work with government entities of some sort, ideally with ones that work at a regional level, whether it's a regional economic community or a river basin organization, Nile Basin Initiative I hear over here, because that way you get access to more countries than just the one. So that's just some of my thoughts from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton. Now, I have with us here Dr. Kiza from the Nile Basin Initiative and quite a lot of experience in development of decision support systems. And food security in the basin is one of the 6 goals of the Nile Basin Initiative strategy for 2027. As I was putting it, really enhancing, addressing food security of countries really cannot really be done without addressing the food security of small-scale producers, because that is this is the majority of the population in our countries, be it in the Nile Basin, in many of sub-Saharan African countries. Now, Dr. Kiza, my question, maybe the difficult question to you is, given your experiences in decision support systems and what kinds of decision support tools can support small-scale producers, climate resilience, and then just share with us your experiences, and how can we make decision support tools really work for small-scale producers as well, not only at government level? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Abdul Karim. And first of all, I wish to thank you and Ilmi for giving us an opportunity to speak at this forum. Actually, we are also joined by a bigger group led by our executive director, who is in the room, Engineer Matemu. So that's how much we value this collaboration with Ilmi. Within the context of Nile Basin Initiative, when I was also watching the video of Awash and all the presentations, one thing that came to my mind is that the same challenges, the same issues, because Awash is really, you replicate them, they expand them to basin level, and then you get the problems that we are dealing with in the Nile Basin. We have fast-growing populations that need more food, but the pace at which food production is growing within the basin is really very low. Leading to the basin, I mean, the recent State of Basin report that we prepared showed that then practically all countries in the basin do not have, they don't produce enough for their net for the importers. So there's a lot of work to be done. More than 90% of our farmers are dependent on rain-fed agriculture, peasant farming, which need to be improved significantly to get them to a level where you can say that that we are improving our food production. So Nile Basin Initiative approaches the whole issue from a point of view of rather than having unilateral development or expanding. All countries have a lot of plans for expanding agriculture production and especially irrigated agriculture. which through strategic assessments that we've carried out, you started, showed that if countries continue developing the way they are developing, there's not enough water in the basin to be able to ensure food security. So at Nile Basin Initiative, we promote this idea of a regionally optimized approach to expanding agriculture or irrigated agriculture. And we carry out all these studies together with the countries to demonstrate also the benefits of cooperation. And within that context, we have a number of tools that we've developed over the years that are facilitating this dialogue among the basin countries to demonstrate how it can all be done. The Nile Basin Decision Support System is our main tool that we use. And the purpose of this tool, I mean, it has a database, but it has a lot of analytical tools that are useful in terms of assessing different scenarios for development and how they will impact the overall water situation. Now, at that broad level, macro level, they'll give you ideas of where to deploy the resources best in order to get the best out of the whole system. But indeed, at the end of the day, we have to bring the outputs of this down to the small scale farmers, because obviously 90 or even more % of the food producers in our system, in our countries, are depending on rain-fed agriculture, and you're moving away towards irrigation. So for sure, dialogue is very important, but dialogue is informed by good data and information, okay? And Nile Basin Initiative tries to lead in terms of this idea of improving the knowledge base to support that kind of planning. Issues of capacity building are very, very crucial, especially now within the on the climate risks that we face and how to address them within our systems. Issues of climate resilient planning is very, very crucial. Having, for example, currently we are developing, we've already developed a river flow forecasting system for the Nile, and currently we are enhancing it because for sure, with all this variability, having a good forecasting system of how much water you're going to expect over the next periods is very, very crucial for planning of the growing seasons and the like. But we are also right now looking into issues of climate finance, for example, because obviously individual farmers, their capacity for accessing some of these climate finances is very low. But as Nile Basin Initiative, bringing together all the countries in terms of also capacity for producing feasible projects, one of the things we do is also preparing investments in irrigation through our investment arms. So there are lots of different things that we are doing, but these are all anchored by the issue of improving knowledge and understanding, improving capacity of the planners and the decision makers, and also being able to transition towards more climate resilient infrastructure overall. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kiza. I also know a little bit about NBI, and NBI does also a lot of work on climate services, especially climate proofing of infrastructure and climate proofing of water resource management plans. Quite a lot of work on forecasting, as he has mentioned, which can make to good use in planning by governments to benefit the small scale producers as well. Thank you very much for the responses. Now we have Deepa online. Deepa, you have heard the evidences from the presentations and the kinds of solutions that have been forwarded. Again, the presentation by Like about the issues around, for example, women and then other marginalized communities or segments of the population. My question to you is, how does, in general, given what we have heard above, and also from the three gentlemen here, how does climate smart water management can be gender responsive and socially inclusive? What your review on that? Deepa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So thanks very much for a very interesting session, very diverse and different issues which speak of the challenges, the problems, as well as the opportunities to address agriculture among smallholder farmers in the Awash Valley. So I think if we consider all the things that have been said, focus on, the changes in policies that have been made, the numerous interventions and innovations that are being planned and designed for climate resilience, improved climate resilience in agriculture, I think we need to sort of really understand that at the heart, at the root of whatever we are trying to do is the lives of marginalized farmers, smallholders, and improving both their coping strategy as well as improving their resilience to these changes, which are increasingly frequent, of higher intensity of challenges, and also unpredictable. So I think as my colleague Liki has already pointed out in her presentation, that even within a very specific group, such as the smallholders, there is significant diversity amongst who makes for a smallholder farmer. And gender, but not just gender, gender is one of the key issues that impacts this diversity. And also what's very important to remember is the fact that increasingly, because of these challenges and the risks with smallholder farming, there's a lot of pull out from agriculture by male farmers, leaving by and large women farmers to manage smallholder agriculture. And this phenomena is called feminization of agriculture, but when you really look at it, it's a feminization of labor and not so much a feminization of, returns and productive gains from these systems, for the very reason that Liki pointed out, that women farmers have a relative lack of access to resources. They're not very well recognized by institutions as key farmers, so they do not have equal access to services and various different types of inputs that are required, be they credit, seeds, improved technology, etc. And the agency to negotiate also significantly varies. What's very interesting is that a recent study pointed out that despite very positive progressive changes in policies around gender and agriculture in Ethiopia, women-headed smallholder households have 54% smaller operational land holdings than male farmers. And not only that, they lack the assets, which I've talked about, the inputs to actually practice productive agriculture. And there is also social cultural norms which really affect their ability to negotiate, be visible, be counted, and to have their needs met. So much so it was reported in this study that pointed out this relatively smaller number of percentage of land holding, that often women smallholder farmers sublet their land to other male farmers, but are really not able to negotiate the terms and conditions of the tenure to their benefit. So I think the fundamental and simple message here is that when we are thinking about climate proofing smallholder agriculture, it's very, very important to think of the client and the end user, and to understand that the end user is not, a homogeneous entity. And also, number two, to not only focus on what are the different factors that make women more vulnerable in terms of production, but also to go beyond production and to look at whether or not women are able to access markets, fetch better prices for their produce, and how they are represented within the agri-value systems, which makes all the difference between the labor and the returns for the labor. And it's not just in Ethiopia that these problems have been reported. In studies conducted elsewhere in Tunisia, Egypt, India, etc., there are examples which show that women are significantly less represented in the agri-value chain systems. And there is a lot of digital innovation and intervention to address these issues. For example, providing timely information to farmers. But I think it's also really important to understand the digital gender gap, which is so key to anything related to climate smart technology and interventions. And in Ethiopia, the most latest statistics point out that only 14% of women actually have access to the internet. And this would make for a significantly large population of urban women. So I think in response to all of these issues and challenges, I think the key message in how do we make climate smart agriculture more gender responsive is the answer that in addition to our focus on tackling with the technical challenges of climate change, the biophysical challenges of climate change, I think we need to pay equal attention to the socioeconomic dimensions and the cultural dimensions of what makes women persistently unequal, even when policies and interventions have really tried to address these issues. And I think Liki's study is a pointer to some of the issues on the ground, but I think much more needs to be done beyond the level of the community and the farmers. And we also really need to focus at the institutional level in the structure and culture of institutions to understand how do we make them more gender responsive? How do we make institutions aware, institutional actors aware of the fact that smallholder farmers or farmers are not a homogeneous entity and will increasingly be poor and marginalized women. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Deepa. So the key message, one of the key messages is we need to think about, give attention to the socio-economic dimension of technological and institutional solutions we're thinking of for small-scale producers, which is absolutely important because the impacts are not the same across the gender divide, and also the solutions will also require those kinds of specificities. Now, I wanted to ask the panel one more question, one more round, but there's no time really, and we are just 5 minutes before the closure. I will give just 1 or 2 chances to the audience here. If you want to ask questions to the panel, I can see 1 hand at the back and 1 here. So maybe can you give him the mic? Over there, the back. So just 1 question per person, please. Then we'll be able to use the 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Henk Holtslag from the mentimeter Smart Center Group, which is a group of water training centers. I have a question for Mr. Curl. You mentioned your question was, which partners do we need to work with? And I did not hear you mentioning training centers in low-cost technologies, because the best present you can give a farmer wife is a well in garden. Would you agree? So should one of the partners not always also be training centers who train local private sector in innovative low-cost technologies for farm wells?
Okay, let's have the second question as well here. And then we will give the floor.
Good morning. I'm Hanan Hassan. I'm from Lebanon. I'm here as a representative from Al Shuf Cedar Society. So we are all gathering for the same vision. But what I find a problem is that there is, as developing countries, so mainly our concentration on developing countries, which is Lebanon is one of them. And what I find a problem is that the government is the lack of awareness. And when we talk about awareness, I would say let's start with the government, especially in developing countries. For example, the funds comes to institutes, NGOs, and the government like lack of there is no real connection between the government and those institutes. So when you mentioned that we are starting from scratch because of the data collection, for example, we don't have data, and this is because the government doesn't go back to ask those NGOs, or there is no policy that says you have to provide us with all the data that you came up with. And also I have some blame on the funders. So when we say we fund a country, this NGO for the project, the distribution, first of all, how we distribute the fund. Like if the government doesn't, everyone knows like there is a lack of management in those countries. So if I do not, as a donor, say that you have to put, for example, infrastructure, we know that this population increase, there's a lot of pollution for underground water, for surface water, because of the population. So if we do not say like, you have to put on one hand, enhance the infrastructure and we can support, but the funder cannot just say, or the donor cannot just say, okay, take the money or use the money for this, and the government itself is not taking a part. So that's why we cannot move forward with this way of working, I guess. And also
we are almost running out of time.
Yes, and last thing, I would also emphasize on having the farmer, and especially women, for example, to be part of the decision making. So let us start with the problem, the need from these farmers, and then come up with solutions. Let them be part of the solution, and not us providing a solution to. So in this way, like we make sure that they will apply and go and move along with the decision.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I take it like enriching the discussion, really making women part of the decision, part of the solution, rather than giving them the solution. Like the government working together with NGOs and other connecting governments with other actors as well, which is actually, yes, absolutely very valid point. So before we close, I give the floor to Anton. That was the question, the first question to you about partnership.
Yeah, it's a great question about partnerships. I think in short, when I talk about support to the farmers, it's not just financial support to farmers, it's also support in terms of capacity building and training and so forth. Who should be doing that? In an ideal world, the government, through agricultural extension workers. But we don't live in that ideal world. So in the real world, we need partners like training institutes, like local NGOs, like the private sector to come in and work with smallholder farmers. And they are doing so. But what I'd like to see is governments working more in partnership with these other actors and implementing policies that make it friendly for them to operate in that space, whether they are NGO organizations providing these services or the private sector. Thank you, Henk.
The discussion will have continued, but we are now almost, time is on. And I really thank you very much, the audience, for very, very interesting questions as well, and for your attention. I thank the presenters and the panelists as well, and then the support staff we have at the back. Thank you so much. And the discussion could still continue individually, bilaterally with the panelists, or also with the presenters. And I wish you a successful stay here in Stockholm. Thank you very much.